Thank you, Lawrence. And I'll ask the panel if you folks would like to come up and take a seat. First of all, I want to thank Lawrence and the group for having me in this spot today. I want to acknowledge Dr. Sutherland. He originally had the idea for this very panel. I think it's a great panel. I think it's a great panel because I'm a water geek, but then I'm in a room full of water geeks, so I guess it's all right to say that. But I think it's a great panel for everybody that's interested in the way water is used on the Arkansas. When you think about this tall order to have the people, to have this discussion today, we really need a select group of people, and we're lucky to have these 5 folks to talk about this. We've got a broad range. I knew that was going to happen. Got a broad range of topics when you think about the Arkansas and the waters coming up from the headwaters near Leadville and being imported from another basin and running through myriad uses from recreational and municipal and industrial and agricultural all along the way, running through major towns and very important parts of this state, just culturally and economically. So it's such an important river and such an important basin. It's great that we have these 5. When I think about water use on the Arkansas, I'm reminded of this TV show that was on when I was a kid, and obviously I'm dating myself here a little bit here, but there's a TV show called Columbo. Does anybody remember Columbo and the guy in the trench coat? And he was a private investigator. His thing was that he would be grilling people. He was asking questions and really grilling them to the nth degree. And then when it seemed to be done and they had satisfied everything he needed to know and he was just about to walk away, he said, well, there's just this one more thing. And that's the way I feel that water use on the Arkansas is, because when you feel you've just met everything and complied with everything, oh, there's just this one more thing. And so this is a great group today to help us understand what some of those things are and why it seems like there's one more thing, but maybe some of the solutions to dealing with that one more thing. So we're going to start, and I think we've got a good sequence here as we go through this. We're going to start with Dan Stoyer from the Attorney General's office, who's going to give us some background on administration of the Arkansas River from the legal standpoint, especially in the context of the Arkansas River Compact with Kansas. Dan is an attorney in the Federal Interstate Water Rights Unit at the Colorado Attorney General's office, and his focus is on the Arkansas River and the Arkansas Compact. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan Stoyer from the Attorney General's office. Yeah, you can. We'll assume he's going to be good, so you can clap.
Oh, I wouldn't assume that.
Let me set you up here.
Do I have a thing, the clicker?
And that's right here.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Kevin and the other organizers for inviting me and for all their work in putting on this forum. I've only been at the Attorney General's office for about 7 months in September, so I'm pretty new at this, and hopefully I get it all right. If I don't, I'm sure one of these guys can correct me. There we go. Okay. By the late 1800s, most of the major irrigation systems in the Arkansas River Valley were developed. By 1910, there was a complex system of private ditches and reservoirs irrigating over 300,000 acres. Obviously, there's not enough water in the river, so by 1935, there were 7 trans-mountain projects bringing water. In 1901, Kansas sued Colorado in the U.S. Supreme Court, asserting essentially a riparian rights argument that Colorado was depriving Kansas, who is a riparian entity, of the continual flow of the river, and that Colorado's prior appropriation regime cannot destroy Kansas's right to that flow. In 1902, the court determined that it had jurisdiction over the controversy, but declined to rule without a greater examination of the facts. Now, the legal nerd in me feels compelled to point out that this was actually a very important decision, both for Kansas in particular and the western states in general. The states now knew that they had a venue for any interstate grievances they had with respect to water. While the court didn't decide the case in Kansas's favor on the merits, without this decision, we probably wouldn't have a compact, and I probably wouldn't have a job. In 1907, the Supreme Court decided the case on the merits and declined to award any relief to Kansas. The court first noted that all states share an equality of right as states, and that no state can impose its legislation on other states. Thus, Kansas isn't entitled to the full natural flow, nor is Colorado entitled to use the water to extinction. The court noted the benefit that Colorado receives from irrigation and also acknowledged the detriment that irrigation causes to Kansas. Nevertheless, the court compared the two and stated it would seem that equality of right and equity between the two states forbids any interference with the present withdrawal of water in Colorado for purposes of irrigation. Thus, they didn't award any relief to Kansas. Now, this case is noteworthy for a couple of reasons. First, while the court didn't award any relief to Kansas, it did provide an outline for how disputes would be addressed in the future. Second, the court announced the doctrine of equitable apportionment, that if the court was required to divide the river, it was going to do so based on a number of equitable factors. Stated a different way, while the court didn't award any relief to Kansas, it nevertheless defined the playing field for both states. Beginning in 1910 and continuing for the next 15-20 years, there were numerous suits filed by private Kansas water users in federal district court against Colorado users. And in 1928, Colorado sued Kansas, seeking an injunction against those suits. This suit wasn't decided until 1943. In 1930, the states agreed to a storage project that would later become John Martin Reservoir, which was fully funded in 1936. Construction began in 39, partial storage in 43, and it was completed in 1948. Now, in 1943, the Supreme Court granted Colorado's request for an injunction against the Kansas citizen suits. The court found that Kansas still hadn't proven the grave injury that it asserted, noting that while some ditches in Kansas may have been abandoned for lack of water, overall, Kansas irrigated acreage had increased steadily, and an apportionment in Kansas's favor would wreak havoc on Colorado water investments. The court instead encouraged both states to negotiate a compact. In 1945, Congress authorized the states to negotiate that compact, and in 1948, the compact was completed, and it was fully ratified in 1949. The purpose of the compact, as stated in Article 1, is to resolve existing and future disputes between the states and to equitably divide and apportion the waters and the benefits arising from John Martin Reservoir. An unspoken purpose of the compact is also to equitably divide the benefits arising from John Martin Reservoir among Colorado users, especially those upstream versus those downstream of John Martin. Article 3 of the compact defines the waters of the Arkansas River to exclude trans-mountain and imported water, and the compact only addresses the waters of the Arkansas River. Obviously, this provision is part of what makes trans-mountain water so attractive to water users in the valley, because it's not subject to the compact. Article 4D, I'm going to bore you here and read this whole quote because it's pretty important. This compact is not intended to impede or prevent future beneficial development of the Arkansas River Basin in Colorado and Kansas, provided that the waters of the Arkansas River shall not be materially depleted in usable quantity or availability for use to the water users in Colorado and Kansas under this compact by such future development or construction. Now, this provision is the primary reason we have the rules in place that we're discussing here on this panel. I should note there's obviously a lot more in the compact than what I just discussed. In fact, as I mentioned, the compact primary purpose is to address the apportionment of the benefits of John Martin Reservoir. But I'm not going to address those provisions because they were not the driving force behind the litigation of the last 30 years, and they didn't lead to our existing rules. They contain technical details that are probably better addressed in some other presentation. But before I move on from the compact, I want to touch on a couple of things. Most notably, the compact doesn't have a specific delivery obligation or apportionment to Kansas. And if you're wondering why, well, remember back in 1943, just a few years prior, Colorado had prevailed against Kansas's attempt to gain an apportionment from the Supreme Court, and Colorado negotiators weren't about to give that victory up. While this may sometimes make our jobs more difficult, it has also provided great flexibility to Colorado by not strictly preventing future development. In 1985, Kansas sued Colorado again with three claims. One, that Colorado's increase in well pumping since 1948 had caused a decline in state line surface flows in violation of Article 4D that I just quoted earlier. Two, that Colorado's winter water storage program at Pueblo Reservoir violates the compact. And three, that Colorado's failure to abide by the Trinidad Reservoir operating principles violates the compact. And the court dismissed the last two claims, but Kansas wins on the first claim. The court found that post-compact wells and improved and increased pumping by existing wells all fall within Article 4D's prohibition against causing material depletions to usable state line flows. Now, the compact doesn't define usable quantity in Article 4D, but the court approved the method determined by the Kansas expert Durbin as modified by the Kansas replacement expert Larson. And I only mention that because sometimes you hear that usable flow is determined by using the Durbin method with Larson coefficients, and that confused me for a long time. So, the model used by Kansas and approved by the court is called the hydrologic institutional model, or normally referred to as the HI model. So the court held that there was a pre-compact pumping allowance, in other words, what Colorado was already pumping at the time of the compact, that was protected, and that amount is 15,000 acre-feet per year. Now, this case, this Kansas versus Colorado case, had numerous iterations, and the use rules were promulgated as a result of this iteration, but I'm going to touch upon all the litigation of this case before we get to those rules. In 2004, the court approved the use of a 10-year rolling average for determination of depletions or credits to Kansas. The reason that is the HI model sometimes overpredicts or underpredicts actual diversions, and the 10-year average is supposed to even those out. The first 10-year period was 1997 to 2006, and it showed no shortage in usable state line flow. Thus, Colorado is in compliance with the compact. In 2004, the court also approved the use of Colorado Water Court as the initial venue for determination of replacement plan credits applied to Colorado's compact obligations, although Kansas can still seek relief in the Supreme Court if it believes it is injured by those court determinations. In 2008, we have the fifth and final report of the special master, which includes the final judgment and decree, and that was approved by the Supreme Court in 2009. The fifth report incorporates the use rules in Appendix J1. And Appendix A3, and I'm going to get to those shortly, Appendix A3 treats post-1985 depletions, that is to say depletions that post-date Kansas is filing the lawsuit, differently than pre-1986 depletions. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. So in the fifth, this A3 says, post-1985 depletion shall be 100% replaced with no reduction on the basis of usability except as provided in Appendix J2 of the decree. Appendix J2 repeats the same language but adds this one exception, which is that notwithstanding the foregoing, no replacement shall be required for depletions caused by post-1985 water uses if John Martin Reservoir is spilling and state line water is passing Garden City, Kansas. Now, all of this is slightly misleading, as technically all depletions pre-1986 and post-1985 must be 100% replaced, but the pre-1986 uses get to use presumptive depletion factors, whereas post-1985 depletions must go to court and prove actual depletions. Also, the pre-1986 uses get reduced by the usability factors described in Appendix C2, whereas post-1985 uses cannot take advantage of these factors and must be replaced 100%. So turning to the use rules, the 1996 use rules, the full name of these rules is the Amended Rules and Regulations Governing the Diversion and Use of Tributary Groundwater in the Arkansas River Basin. And these rules were promulgated under the State Engineers Compact Rulemaking Authority, 3780-104. And I printed it out all there, but I'm not going to read that whole thing to you. I'll spare you that. Studies had shown that curtailing groundwater diversions would increase usable state line flow and make more water available to senior surface rights holders. It's an obvious point, but groundwater diversions can't be administered the same way as surface diversions because of the delayed impacts to the stream. Thus, to use a well instead of a surface right, you must have a plan to replace the delayed depletions to the stream when the surface right isn't in priority. The state engineer determined that the curtailment of post-compact well pumping and diversions of groundwater by junior appropriators would increase usable state line flow. Thus, diversions of tributary groundwater have to be discontinued unless a plan is in place to replace these out-of-priority depletions. And the presumptive stream depletion factors, or PDFs, for different types of water uses are established. To explain these a little bit, I'll give you an example. Studies have shown that groundwater used to supplement surface water irrigation results in smaller stream depletions than groundwater diversions that are used as the sole source of supply of irrigation. So supplemental groundwater has a different PDF than sole source groundwater. These PDFs make administration easier and reduce costs for well users, but a well user may also provide a site-specific analysis to demonstrate that stream depletions are different for that well. Stream depletions must be replaced in time, location, and amount, and I bolded that because that's pretty important. And the use rules provide a more cost-effective way for well users to replace depletions by allowing use of Rule 14 plans approved through the state engineer rather than augmentation plans approved through Water Court, which is a rather lengthy process. Turning to the irrigation improvement rules, as with the use rules, these are also promulgated under state engineer's compact rulemaking authority. I'm going to skip that next bullet point there. The Special Master's first report in 1994 examined Article 4D and found that it protects the usable flows of the river as of the time of the compact, including return flows from existing irrigation uses, from material depletion caused by any increased consumptive use in Colorado. And that was affirmed in 1995 by the Supreme Court. And the court said that improved and increased pumping by existing wells clearly falls within Article 4D's prohibition against improved or prolonged functioning of existing works, if such action results in material depletions in usable river flows. Now, following that rationale, improvements to existing surface water irrigation systems also fits the phrase improved or prolonged functioning of existing works. And it's important to note that these rules are not designed to stifle efforts to improve efficiency. It's just that irrigation return flows from Colorado farms that were being used by Kansas in 1948 cannot now be consumed by Colorado water users because of improved irrigation efficiency. In the early part of the 2000s, we saw a big rise in irrigation improvements like center pivot systems that increased the need for these rules. And beginning in 2006, Kansas started raising concerns that these improvements would deplete state line flows and violate the compact. ISAM, or the Irrigation System Analysis Model, was developed to reduce the costs to individual farmers to comply with these rules. It incorporates assumptions about a variety of variables and evaluates proposed improvements without requiring farmers to acquire an individualized engineering report. The rules only cover surface water systems because groundwater systems are already addressed through the use rules. Now, if a surface water irrigation system improvement falls within the scope of these rules and must be approved, the farmer has three potential ways to achieve compliance. There's the Rule 8 individual application, which can only involve the subject water right and no other water sources. If there's other water sources, it has to be part of a Rule 10 plan. There's the Rule 10 plans, which allow a group of farmers to join in together in one application and use other waters to maintain historical return flows. And then there's the Rule 11 general permits, which are for types of improvements that don't need to be evaluated individually because the state engineer has determined that they won't cause a compact violation. There we go. Okay. And then I just put up here some of the references that I discussed today if you need to find them. And thus, both the use rules and the irrigation improvement rules are critical pieces of Colorado's efforts to comply with the compact. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Coming up next, Bill Tyner, the Assistant Division Engineer in Division 2, is going to give us a primer on the different types of plans. And one of the things we just heard from Dan in the use rules that have come out of all the compact litigation, we heard the comment, you have to have a plan to replace delayed depletions to the stream. So it appears that can mean a lot of things, and it could be done a lot of different ways. Bill Tyner, I think, is a great person to talk to us about that. He was involved in the original development and implementation of the rules, and to go on any further about his credentials would just take way too much time. So having this expert in Division 2 and on the Arkansas explain this to us, Bill Tyner.
I thought it might be helpful to highlight one of the notable events that took place yesterday, since it looks like some folks were here today that weren't here yesterday, and a few folks were here yesterday and are not. I think one was John McLeod from the Gunnison River Basin, who talked a little bit about their basin implementation plan and talked about the fact that they were open to the potential for a trans-mountain diversion under certain conditions that the east slope would need to comply with. And I thought it was kind of surprising we didn't really ask him what those conditions were, but I overheard Jay Winter and Jairus Danielson talking a little bit, and I think I got some clues about those conditions, but I'm just not sure. You'll have to decide for yourself. Jay was saying something about flight instruction and swine, and so I think that may be one of the conditions. And then Jairus was saying something about, I don't know how we're going to get a refrigeration unit that large, and the devil's in the details. So I think that has to do with one of the other conditions that has to occur, but I'm only kidding. I think there was some notable conversations that took place between the different divisions that would even get the Gunnison Basin to consider a new trans-mountain diversion. All right, I'll talk to you about. Oh,
I'm not doing my job.
That's okay. All right, I do have some backup information that they did place in your folders that I thought would give you some detail that I won't give in this presentation if you end up wanting to know a little bit more about some of the topics that I'll show. The types of plans that we're going to talk about today are mostly going to be focused on wells, and then at the very end we'll talk a little bit about the plans that affect the ability to maintain return flows for irrigation improvements. So I wanted to clarify just a little bit that there's an awful lot of wells that can operate within our basin that are either not required to replace under one of the options under the amended use rules. They may have obligations under their permits in certain areas of the state, or they may be exempt from replacement at all. So we'll talk about those a little bit, and then we'll talk about how plans are operated that can maintain no injury to senior water rights by replacing stream depletion. So let's talk about exempt wells a little bit. Statute provides a couple of categories that are commonly known, fairly commonly known. It's still quite possible to get an exempt well permit for domestic, livestock, and lawn and garden type irrigation use. The current statute limits the flow rate to 15 gallons a minute for those types of wells. We did have quite a few wells as we began to administer the use rules that were larger high-capacity wells that involved other uses besides these exempt uses. It had irrigation use, for example, but perhaps the well really hadn't been used. Maybe it had been sold off onto a smaller piece of property to where really all they were using was domestic and livestock and irrigation use. And the late registration of those wells, the abandonment of the non-exempt uses, irrigation, allowed some owners to be able to keep a well that could retain a 50-gallon-a-minute flow rate. So those are probably the most common exempt wells that you would know about. The others that you might be a little less familiar with, exempt commercial wells can still be gotten for businesses that only need drinking and sanitary within a business and don't have access to a municipal supply. So that's a type of exempt permit that can still be gotten without replacement. You can also have a well that can be used exclusively for firefighting, but there's pretty tight restrictions on it. It's supposed to be capped and locked and only used in the event of a fire. And then finally, one you might have been a little more familiar with is wells that are just used to monitor groundwater levels. So you can get a well permit for constructing a well that's just to monitor groundwater levels. The designated basins in the Arkansas, you can see in the pink areas on the east, a portion of the northern high plains designated basin, and then in the southern high plains is in the south of the Arkansas River in that lower right corner of the map. The upper Big Sandy and the upper Black Squirrel are the designated basin areas in yellow and green, and those are controlled by the Groundwater Commission, and permits to use water from those areas are locally controlled by the individual groundwater management districts. And there are some contact references in this backup document for those areas. So those areas, wells constructed in those areas, are not required to replace depletions under the amended use rules. The Denver Basin, only a portion of the fairly large Denver Basin exists within the Arkansas up towards Colorado Springs in El Paso County, and then edges over a little bit into the adjacent counties. Denver Basin wells are drilled into an aquifer, set of aquifers that have a limited life, and so their ability to be constructed are based on land ownership and are also typically decreed in water court, but the replacement of any depletions that might occur, which are usually quite small, to the river system are not done so much with in compliance with the amended use rules as through that water court process to obtain the Denver Basin water rights. Often they're associated with plans for augmentation, which is an element under the amended use rules, but Denver Basin wells are listed as an exemption under the amended use rules. And then Dakota Cheyenne wells that were in existence and are being used for their decreed and permitted uses prior to April 1996 are only required to measure their groundwater withdrawals and then report that use annually. Thing that kind of trips people up on Dakota Cheyenne wells a little is that oftentimes folks will want a new use out of those formations, and new uses after April 1996 do require a determination of whether that Dakota Cheyenne well is tributary or non-tributary. And if it's tributary, it does require that you augment the stream depletions from that tributary well. Many of you may know about some of the hog farms that went in the 90s and the early part of the 2000s that often relied on Dakota wells for their supply, and those hog confined operations, and those wells had to replace depletions. So that's always a confusing factor. We're getting a lot of questions now on marijuana grow operations, and folks will come in with a Dakota well and they'll say, can we use this without having to do any replacement? But I don't think anybody anticipated that a marijuana grow operation was a beneficial use prior to 1996. So we're generally trying to send those folks to water court to get that taken care of. The last group that I'll mention is non-tributary wells that don't have to replace depletions. There are a number in the Arkansas River Basin. The most recent area where non-tributary determinations has come up fairly regularly, and Kevin's been real involved with this, for oil and gas wells that produce water, there is a requirement that you either comply with the produced water rules, which would require you to augment depletions if those oil and gas wells withdraw water that's determined to be tributary. So oil and gas companies have spent quite a bit of money trying to show that the formations they drill into are non-tributary, and oftentimes those are 5,000 or 6,000 feet deep. So those non-tributary determinations, a number of them have been approved. Those are posted on the DWR website when the applications come in and when they're acted on. So that's something that may be of interest to you. But the non-tributary, if somebody wants to try to prove a well is non-tributary, I thought it was kind of helpful to illustrate the burden they have. If you were to use a well at the rate of 100 acre-feet per year, you have to be able to show through your engineering study that the stream depletion caused by using it at that 100 acre-feet per year rate would never get any larger than 1/10 of 1%. And so that kind of gives you a feel for how difficult it is to get a non-tributary well. All right, so now we'll get to how you comply with the use rules, what your options are in the Arkansas Basin. So as Dan already kind of gave the background for the use rules, fulfill these purposes that are every bit as good as a plan for augmentation approved by water court, as long as we do a good job of administering these rules. The wells that were subject to these rules, when we got to June 1st of 1996, that was a decision point for many people. They either had to stop pumping their wells or they had to comply with the rules in one manner or another. And many chose to just inactivate their wells and have left their wells inactive. But for those who chose to forge ahead, there were some good options that we still have in our basin. So Rule 14 plans are the common name for a plan that allows well pumpers to annually propose how much they will pump and how they will replace depletions. This type of plan, allowed under our rules, we thought was at risk back in the early 2000s when the Empire Lodge case came out. We thought that perhaps all of our plans would have to go through a water court process, but we were spared that. Statute specifically spared us from having to do that. This is a big benefit for well owners in the Arkansas Basin that can make decisions based on changing hydrologic conditions and changing availability of replacement water to adjust how much pumping they try to do each year. But there are still the options that exist for other groundwater uses for wells that aren't able to participate in Rule 14 plans. Those include substitute water supply plans and water court decree plans for augmentation. The Rule 14 plans, I'll focus on them a bit. Most of the high capacity wells that were subject to the ruling by the Supreme Court that said we needed to comply with the compact ended up landing in these Rule 14 plans. And those wells existed as irrigation wells or as commercial, municipal, industrial wells. At the time, Kansas sued us in 1985. And so we restrict the participation in those Rule 14 plans to uses that were already in existence at that time, so that those wells that our participants can be used with the presumptive depletion factors that Dan mentioned and the usability factors. The Lower Arkansas Water Management Association, or LAMA, is the large plan association from John Martin Reservoir on downstream. Colorado Water Protective and Development Association is the largest in terms of the number of wells. From year to year, either CWPDA or LAMA can propose the most pumping. The capacity of CWPDA's wells are typically a little bit smaller than LAMA's because the aquifer allows a little larger rate of pumping as you go east, so the LAMA wells tend to be higher flow rate wells. But both those associations are really important to the Arkansas Basin, as is the Arkansas Groundwater Users Association, which also has been and is a major well association in the Arkansas Basin. I'll talk a little bit about the three of those. The LAMA plan serves just under 500 wells, and you can see from this particular map that a lot of the LAMA membership is in Prowers County. The darker blue counties are the higher percentages in their plan, Prowers, Benton, Kiowa, and then they also have wells in those light blue counties. The Colorado Water Protective and Development, or CWPDA plan, is primarily focused in these counties, again the dark blue being the more dominant percentages, light blue also including wells. So CWPDA covers a wide range of area and provides service to a lot of people. The Arkansas Groundwater Users coverage area is going to look a lot like CWPDA's. They service a lot of people that are in Pueblo County, and then also cover a number of other counties. Let's switch gears just a little bit, although I maybe shouldn't have gone too fast over Rule 14 plans. You know, over the last decade with the types of hydrology we've had, these plans have been literally able to adjust their pumping probably by 200 or 300% from the lowest year to the highest year that they could operate under that 10-year period. It's difficult to do that if you've got a water court approved plan for augmentation, because you generally have to build your replacement portfolio to match what you're really going to want to do. And unless you can afford to buy all your water and have it permanently available to you, you're going to be limited by how much you can bring to that plan. These Rule 14 plans have the ability to adjust if other temporary water is available. They can take advantage of it. If it's not, they can adjust down and can survive a year. And that's what many had to do in this last year in 2013. The Rule 14 plans did a really good job of 1 year of drought hedge protection in 2012. We're still not quite to the point where it's easy to get through 2 years of the type of drought that we had in the lower Arkansas Basin. So substitute water supply plans, I'll run through those just so that is a little bit demystified. Statute provides specifically for substitute water supply plans that are related to groundwater for sand and gravel mining. And so an active sand and gravel mine can operate with either annual or oftentimes we'll approve plans for a 2-year period. While they're actively mining, they can operate under a state engineer approved substitute water supply plan. As they get to the end of that plan, they'll have obligations to either make sure there's no exposed groundwater, or if there is, they'll ultimately have to get a water court approved plan for augmentation. Those plans typically cover the extraction of the material and the water that's lost on the mined product, and they cover any incidental operations like dust suppression, evaporation from any exposed pit area. concrete batching is sometimes an incidental operation that's covered under those plans. There was a little bit of a carve out in statute that said that mines that were in existence prior to 1981 could avoid replacing evaporation losses from those areas exposed before 1981. Then after the Empire Lodge case, an important section of statute that was amended was in 3792-308, and that portion of Colorado Revised Statutes allows the state engineer to continue to do some substitute water supply plan approvals under certain conditions, and the most typical three I have listed here under 3084, when someone is applying for a change of water right or a plan for augmentation in water court, the state engineer can approve a substitute supply plan that allows them to undertake that while they're waiting for their court process to conclude. So since court can take, especially used to take, 5 years or more, this was very helpful because people didn't have to shelve an idea till they were all the way through water court. They could continue to pursue that idea, safely replace depletions, but under a state engineer's approval. Same thing with 3085. It allowed for projects that were not intended to last forever, making it kind of unreasonable to do a plan for augmentation if it was going to be for a short duration, to be approved by the state engineer. And then the last one is for emergency conditions. So I'll highlight a couple of those. The one that's probably gotten a lot of press recently is the GP Farms substitute supply plan that we're in the midst of reviewing, where GP Farms is seeking to install large number of sprinklers down by the state line and then make some other adjustments on some farms down in Prowers County. And because those irrigated lands and the use of groundwater were a post-1985 use, those couldn't be done under the Rule 14 plans. They had to be done under a 3084 type substitute supply plan. And that is allowed because they also applied to water court to add the wells involved to the LAMA plan for augmentation. LAMA does operate both a Rule 14 plan and a plan for augmentation. An example of a 3085 plan that might be familiar to some, this one's done now, I believe, but CDOT had a project involving highway work that they needed a little bit of water for that construction project and could obtain it from a source that didn't cause depletions to the stream beyond 5 years. And the project was going to be less than 5 years. So the state engineer could approve the use of groundwater under that project. Groundwater, or could have been a surface water supply, to supply that project for less than 5 years. And then an emergency type situation, this is down near Walsenburg. Walsenburg had a situation where their supply to the area kind of to the north end of Walsenburg over a hump. Any of you who've driven into Walsenburg from the north know that you kind of go up over a hill and down in. Well, those businesses on the north caused Walsenburg's municipal supply to not return to the river in the same location that their water rights really ought to have. And so in order to give them a chance to allow those businesses to stay in operation until they could get it permanently solved, the emergency type substitute supply plan was approved by the state engineer. Now we'll go on to the last, plans for augmentation. I probably have painted a little bit of a negative picture about plans for augmentation, but they are important in this basin as well, in that they're designed for more permanent operations where maybe flexibility is not as important. You can live with designing the plan to meet your needs, acquiring the replacement supplies you need, and it's worth just getting approved in court to have it once and over done with. plan for augmentation process is also good in that it allows other water right owners to participate in that process and ensure their water rights have gotten protection. And so, I don't want to speak badly of plans for augmentation. There are many in the Arkansas Basin, and they serve an important purpose. They can be the most costly to complete. That's probably the one big negative. Notable examples that we have in the Arkansas Basin, from the top to the bottom, the Tri-State did a large change case for about half of the Amity Canal down in District 67 in order to make headway towards a future power plant that they haven't developed yet, but they have the water right change in place that will allow them to do power plant development in the future. That's under a plan for augmentation once they begin that new use. The Upper Arkansas Water Conservancy District plan is in the headwaters area of the basin and has been very important in that area to allow some subdivision type development in some cases, and then also just to adjust to situations where maybe there was already a subdivision plan for augmentation that allowed only inside uses, but homeowners wanted to have some outside uses. Upper Ark serves a good purpose by being able to cover those types of uses. And then in the again, spreading out across the basin a little, Llama does have a plan for augmentation that covered all the wells and other uses that they couldn't cover in their Rule 14 plan. That was decreed in about 2007 under a 2002 court case. Colorado Springs has a plan for augmentation to cover quite a few wells that serve areas that they don't serve with their municipal supply. And then more recently, City of Rocky Ford did a plan for augmentation for their municipal needs that also changed some water rights that they use for augmentation. Just to give you a feel for the number of plans for augmentation in the Arkansas Basin, the water districts are shown on this map in black. So District 11 is up in Chaffee County, and clear at the bottom is District 67, which covers the large area to the east. And the number of plans for augmentation in each one of those water districts is shown in red, bold, and underlined. So you can see that the Denver Basin subdivision type plans dominate the population in Division 2, 287 up in District 10. There's also a large number of those types of plans up in the headwaters area that are covered by augmentation plans, many of which use Twin Lake shares for replacement. And then we've got less significant populations, but plans for augmentations throughout the basin. So by far there's more of these than substitute water supply plans or Rule 14 plans, but all three types are quite important. All right, now we'll switch gears just a little bit, and I'm hoping I'm staying on time good enough, Kevin? Good. Okay. The irrigation improvement rules, Dan set a good background for why we had to do those, and I think we're still in the process of adjusting to those rules 4 years in. This will be the fourth year of operation under those rules. The Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District, excuse me, I'm stumbling over that, has been instrumental along with Colorado Water Conservation Board in helping get the initial plans up and running. The plans cover the type of improvements that I've shown here. By far the most dominant is sprinkler and drip systems, but each of those systems improvements, as Dan mentioned under Article 4D, we can improve our irrigation systems. We just can't reduce the flows that are going to occur at the state line. So each of these things have the potential for doing that and are regulated by the irrigation improvement rules, can be covered by the plans that respond to those rules. So again, the most common improvement that took place was where historically flood irrigated fields irrigated by flood and furrow and gravity have been converted to sprinkler irrigation. Just to kind of illustrate that, this is a Bent County, Powers County area map of the Fort Lyon drainage area prior to about 2001 that shows a couple of sprinklers, but mostly flood ground throughout that ditch system area. And then from 2013, that same area has benefited by a large number of sprinklers being put in. And these sprinkler systems are generally all covered by the types of plans that the irrigation improvement rules contemplate. So the way you comply, the only compliance that we've had so far is under Rule 10 plans done pursuant to those irrigation improvement rules. And again, Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District was instrumental in helping get those up and running. CWCB provided funding. So they've helped with plans all 4 of the years. Their current plans are pending for approval. The Fort Lyon plan under the Rule 10 approvals is on their way to, I think, self-governance, and probably will maybe use Lower Ark less and less as time goes on. That'll be a good thing for them, and probably Lower Ark believes that's a good thing for everybody involved to have them manage their own future. This year, the Lower Arkansas Water Management Association, LAMA, also submitted a plan for approval. So this will be the first year that we've had anybody except the Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District submit plans. I guess I got to the point where I'm not going to take questions now, right? We're going to do it at the end?
Yeah.
Okay. So, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I think that was a great explanation of the different types of plans, and it was a good continuation of how Dan started out with this need to replace depletions that are caused by water uses. And the one thing that we seem to assume, as Bill was talking, is that there was replacement water available in these plans. And that gives rise to the question, well, what if you've got a plan and the replacement water just isn't there? The replacement water runs out for whatever reasons. And that's what Steve Whitty is going to talk about for us. Steve Whitty is the division engineer in the Pueblo office for Division 2. I said I wasn't going to read bios, but I just want to take one piece of this. Steve's responsibilities include distribution and regulation of the waters within the basin according to the prior appropriation system and the terms of the Arkansas River Compact. But that's all he does. Nothing else really, right? So Steve Whitty, division engineer from Division 2. Thanks.
Stretch break. You've been sitting for a little while, huh? Go ahead, feel free. Smoke them if you got them. No, I don't think you do.
You mean the marijuana?
No, I did not mean that. So, thank you for the introduction. Kevin told you what my assigned topic was, and I'll get to it by and large. But we got together for a few minutes a couple of weeks ago to kind of get our stories straight, so we didn't repeat a lot of the same things to you, hopefully. And it was suggested that maybe I'd take a little bit of time, because there's a broad spectrum of people attend these things, to talk about the basin in general, a little education piece mixed in with it. So let's see how this thing works. Okay, so my predecessor, Bob Jesse, had a pretty good quote, and he attempted to describe the Arkansas Basin as it's really a desert, typified by years of insufficient rainfall interspersed with drought. So that does seem to characterize the Arkansas here recently. And and I think the point is that it's always kind of been that way. There's been a succession of efforts to try to deal with the problem of a deficient water supply. And the progression kind of followed a logical path of least cost and available technology. You know, first we tried the direct flow water rights, the direct flow diversions thing, and that worked well for a little while. And then people still realized that there was more land that could be irrigated and not enough water, so they went to reservoir development to make water usable that would otherwise be unusable. And then that still didn't do the trick, so there was attempts to supplement the water supply with trans-basin diversions. Again, a little more expensive proposition. Later on, as technology developed, primarily, people tried wells, and wells were really a significant solution to the drought of the 50s and the 70s. That's when high-intensity well development took place in the Arkansas Valley. And then most recently, the attempt to squeeze a drop of water just a little bit harder have come about through various types of irrigation efficiency improvements. So we'll start with a little discussion of direct flow rights. And this illustration is simply meant to show it's a accumulation of water rights by amount versus appropriation dates. And that red arrow there at about 2,000 CFS, you can see that people of the Arkansas Valley had appropriated 2,000 cubic feet per second by 1887. Okay? Well, the river at Wellsville today is, what, 1,000? So we don't get up to 2,000 CFS very often. Half the water at Wellsville today is probably Trans Mountain water that's supplementing the flow. So just to make the point that there's much more demand for water than there typically is water supply available. So then the next step, as I said, was to develop some reservoirs. This is just a map that shows where some of the principal reservoirs are. And the group thought it might be helpful to spend a few minutes just talking about or try to educate folks about reservoirs that are in the Arkansas Basin. This is a listing of reservoirs by size. John Martin Reservoir is clearly the largest at 343,000 acre feet of capacity. Great Plains Reservoirs, 266,000 acre feet of capacity, just no water. Pueblo Reservoir is the next largest and on down the list. So this little illustration I put together, I attempted to also identify privately owned reservoirs, federal reservoirs with private participation, and then purely federal reservoirs. Really, in my estimation, we only have one purely federal reservoir, which is John Martin, operated by the Army Corps of Engineers and regulated, if you will, by the Arkansas River Compact, which was authorized by Congress. So the benefits of John Martin are completely controlled by the Arkansas River Compact Administration, except in flood control circumstances. The purple ones are kind of a mix, you know. There are federal development. For example, Pueblo Reservoir. Pueblo Reservoir sort of serves as a terminal storage facility for imported water brought through by the Fry-Ark project, but Jim leases out excess space to lots of folks. And so that shades that what otherwise would be a pure red reservoir into kind of a purplish one. And then there are a number of private reservoirs. At the upper end of the system, there's Clear Creek Reservoir, which started out life as an irrigation reservoir, yeah, and has since then become a municipal reservoir. And that's kind of true with several other reservoirs in the basin. So this next slide is identical, except it shows the appropriation dates. The dates when Arkansas River appropriations were established. Henry Reservoir near Ordway has the earliest, 1891, and generally proceeding down the list. John Martin Reservoir actually has no Colorado water right. Its right to store water is established by the compact. And it basically functions to sop up excess water before it gets away from us, all right? During the winter time, we gather water that would generally be unusable for irrigation, put it in storage for a better time and use by citizens in both states. Big floods come along. We capture it when it's available, and we put it in storage for later and better use. And so I have it down there as having a 1949 appropriation date, but in fact it doesn't have a water right. Okay, so what do reservoirs do for us? Basically, reservoirs are just a retiming device. Now, Jim Broderick made a good point yesterday that they provide infrastructure that allow for water to be moved. In effect, they kind of provide a marketplace for transactions of water to take place between parties that have water in different reservoirs, for example. So there's both the traditional retiming element of turning unusable water into usable water, and there's also this infrastructure component that enables water users to better manage the available water supply. Trans-mountain diversions, we have a few of them. Generally, as you might imagine, they're all up at the headwaters. And this slide shows the amounts that were imported into the Arkansas River Basin in 2013. In total, 119,000 acre feet. Bill made the point that the Rule 14 plans provide a great deal of flexibility, and we're somewhat unique in the Arkansas Basin of having these somewhat flexible plans where the amount of pumping, which is dependent on the amount of replacement water, can vary based upon what the market will bear under the circumstances. So there's a bit of a trade-off here. This illustrates how pumping has fluctuated since we began regulating wells in 1996. And the trade-off is that we trade certainty for higher regulation. Plans for augmentation oftentimes operate on, people would have liked for them to operate on autopilot, right? You create a plan for augmentation, it's approved by court, it's got a certain water supply, and you just can kind of walk away and forget it because those out of priority depletions will be taken care of by a reliable replacement source. Rule 14 kind of turns that on its ear and said, no, we have a replacement plan here, but we may have to regulate in times of replacement water shortage to prevent injury to either senior Colorado water rights or to our compact partners. And I guess the points I wanted to make here are that in 2013, we were able to regulate that pumping so that pumping was only about 25% of that in the previous year. The primary limiting factor was the scarcity of replacement water. And yeah, we have to remember that there's a certain advantage to the use of wells that is inherent in the timing difference between when water is available and when it has to be replaced. So you can kind of play this leveraging game of taking water now, and I'll repay you on Tuesday, right? Well, that's kind of the concept. But there's also inherent in that timing replacement is that you can arguably justify 2.5 times the amount of pumping with the available replacement supply in that first year. And then finally, the availability of sufficient affordable replacement water has been of concern since 1996. In 1996, that was the first effort to really meaningfully incorporate wells into the priority system of water allocation. And I know that Dennis Montgomery, many of you knew Dennis. He was one of our lead counsels in the Colorado-Kansas interstate litigation. Dennis was adamant that we needed to try to protect the well-based economy in the Arkansas Valley of Colorado. And he thought we could do that with a type of replacement scheme, but he was very afraid that once we went through all the effort to try to come up with these plans, this mechanism, then there simply wouldn't be any replacement water available. So he beat the bushes. He went to Pueblo Board of Waterworks and banged down the door and put Alan Hamill in a arm lock. And and Alan said, yeah, we think we're going to have some excess municipal supplies. He went to the FRIARC board and said, what about the FRIARC return flows? Is that something that the Southeastern District is willing to make available? And he got assurances there. So that has been a concern for quite some time. Okay, made those points. This is a slide I've used a number of times. I quote my old buddy Dale Mock there. He got it in the paper in 2012. We have to remember that wells still can provide a hedge against drought, but it's really only, up to this point in time, with our present level of planning, we've only been able to provide a 1-year hedge. You get a 2-year drought, and you get what happened last year, right? You get 70. You only get pumping of about 25% of the previous year. So it can be an effective tool for use in the valley, but at this point in time, we've only been able to plan for 1 year's insurance. Efficiency improvements. This is the late developer. Bill's already explained. We currently have 2 plans in operation. Involving about 81 farms. And so this hasn't resulted in a great draft on available replacement supplies so far. About 1,200 to 1,300 acre feet in the current year. Next year, with an improved water supply, that replacement obligation actually may be somewhat higher. So I want to talk to you now a little bit about how replacement water has been provided for those return flow maintenance plans or compact compliance plans. And you can tell I borrowed this slide from Bill Tyner. Got a little animation in there. There were releases from an if and when account in Pueblo Reservoir. This was water that the Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District acquired. I believe it was from Aurora last year. And then we sought to take advantage of some contract exchanges between Pueblo and Lake Meredith. So that gives you, this is an example of how reservoirs provide that marketplace for transactions to take place. So reservoir storage is part of the infrastructure necessary to make that happen. And so then we also had available to us last year some return flows of FRIARC water and Busk Ivanhoe return flow that was leased out from the city of Aurora to farmers last year that we were able to take advantage of in these replacement plans. So I wanted to now turn to what replacement sources for ag have been. I've touched on that a little bit. And this is a really tough thing to estimate. I think Jay made reference to this study yesterday in his talk when he said that there were estimates of 3% sprinkler growth assumed, and so they came up with the Rule 10 requirement at the present time is in the neighborhood of about 1,200 acre feet, but on those growth projections, then the demand might get up to as much as 19,700. So obviously, again, that growth projection is a big assumed variable that may or may not prove to be right by the year 2050. And this particular study was also looking at the potential for lease fallowing or the super ditch to provide replacement water for well pumping. And so they had some estimates there of how much additional water that lease fallowing might bring to the replacement table. This slide is to make the point that there's been about 19,000 acres of dry up that have already taken place in the Arkansas Valley. This is ag to ag dry up, okay, to support the Rule 14 plans. I think Mike Gibson said yesterday that in the San Luis Valley, they've dried up an equal number of acres as they're getting started. But as you'll see in a minute, the ag to ag dry up that has taken place in the Arkansas Valley really is only about half of the water supply that we've needed to sustain our Rule 14 program. And this is in effect more akin to the traditional buy and dry. Here I've tried to compare some of the replacement sources that have been used by the different associations over the past little over a decade, 12 years. Here you can see that Llama has relied primarily on ag-to-ag transfers and to a much lesser degree on excess municipal return flows or fry arc return flows. Agua here is a big user of fry arc return flows, but because they have Excelsior water, you'll see that red line represents that there's some, the native CUs, the green line, that's their Excelsior component. It's a part of their portfolio of replacement, but certainly fry arc return flows are predominant. Colorado Water Protective and Development Association, you can see that their bread and butter has been fry arc return flows. So I wanted to linger on this slide just a little bit. This is for the last 12 years and represents the average, okay, the average amount of replacement water that has gone for wells in the past dozen years. Topping the list is fry arc return flow at about 11,220 acre feet. Is that right? Excuse me. Native CU is our big one at 18,000. The purple slice. So that's that 19,000 acres of dry up that we talked about has generated about 18,778 acre feet on average. Now some of those years, not all of those supplies were in the mix, obviously, but this is just kind of a broad perspective on what's been going on. Second in line has been the fry arc return flows, and the excess municipal return flow, excess municipal supplies really have only been about 5%. So I guess we'll talk a little bit about how these replacement supplies are at risk in times of drought and in the future in the next portion of my talk. can this level of replacement continue? I think that's the real question that I've been asked to wrestle with today. And I obviously don't know. Who assigned me this task anyhow? You know, turning water into wine's one thing, but making this stuff is a different thing. I don't know where these replacement supplies are going to come from, but I do know that obviously drought reduces the availability of replacement supplies, right? As drought affects the amount of water that can be imported by the Fry-Arc project, there's less water allocated to ag. Less water allocated to ag means less return flows, less replacement supplies. Municipalities obviously don't have excess in drought. They have to look after their own interests, and so that's puts a squeeze on the available supply. And then as that supply, I'm no economist, but you know, I do get the idea that demand goes up when the supplies decrease and prices go along with it. And so that puts a squeeze on what the users of Rule 14 wells can afford. So there's obviously an upper limit there. Competition among various users has an effect, and as does available storage. And I also want to touch on the fact that there is a potential that some allocation policies and practices by the Southeastern District are not necessarily assured. So there are several different factors of concern here. This is some data that my friend Chris gave me to plot up the excess municipal water supply spot market price. Shows the high and the low since 2006, 2007 actually, I guess. And you can see that the first several years it was fairly static, but there have been some real bounces and the trend overall has been upward. So I also have to ask ourselves the question, just how certain is that, 25% of our water replacement water supply that has come from the Fry-Arc project? It's really a myth that is guaranteed for agriculture. That has always been the way it was, but it isn't necessarily assured for all time. There is a application in water court that would allow the Southeastern District to exchange unused or unsold Fry-Arc return flows back into Pueblo Reservoir. Is there an incentive to do that? The district says that they have no interest in doing that. But in the day and age of $630 an acre foot leased water, is there some incentive to do that? I think it's undeniable. So that's a concern that I think that the well associations need to attend to. So what can be done? Here are a couple ideas, and I put that little symbol in the upper right-hand corner to remind myself that nothing is new under the sun. And there is nothing new here either. There are really just variations on old themes. But I think topping the list is lease fallowing. I think lease fallowing can provide a source of replacement water for the future, and maybe is preferable to the traditional buy and dry. The concern there, I think, in everybody's mind, maybe unspoken, or in some circles it is spoken, is the suggestion that lease fallow water is $500 an acre foot water. If that's the case, there's probably a problem in using it for replacement sources. I think development of recharge facilities presents additional opportunities. And although it's dangerous to say so, I think that any credits that we have established at the state line with Kansas provides a opportunity for a select set of users to make use of that when it is available. I think that some effort needs to be made to try to secure assurances regarding the continued availability of Fry-Arc return flow, and suggest that conservation is a big piece of the future puzzle. Going first to lease fallow, I think the associations or anyone that's involved in a Rule 14 plan needs to engage in a meaningful dialogue with the lease fallow folks to see if there's an opportunity to lease water under certain circumstances at prices that are affordable to you. We've seen the spot market price go up to levels where ag has demonstrated their ability to pay far more than they have traditionally for fry arc return flow, but they certainly haven't reached the $500 an acre foot level. So I think there needs to be some talk between the associations on whether there can be leased ag-to-ag transfers. I threw this in to just illustrate the fact that how recharge facilities can, in effect, act like a type of reservoir. If water is returned into the system and lagged back to the stream, it's not a lot different than in a watertight reservoir with the gate slowly or slightly opened, right? Water accretes back to the stream and can provide a retiming of available replacement supplies at a more opportune time. And that happened to be a unit response function for the Catlin Canal, which shows that 95% of that water is then drained back to the stream over a period of about 5 years. Okay, this is that state line piece. There is, I think, at the present time, a credit to the state line of about 58,000 acre feet. I hesitate to even bring this up as a possible replacement source because it's only available as a replacement source for a certain set of folks. It has the ability to replace usable state line depletions to Kansas, period, okay? I think it can be further limited by saying it's available for replacement of state line depletions for Kansas by LAMA members. Why? LAMA put the water in the offset account that generated these credits. So does it do anything to help out depletions to the Lamar Canal? No, just Kansas, okay? So it's a very select group that can take advantage of this. I've already mentioned, I think it would be a good idea for the associations to negotiate further assurances with the Southeastern District regarding the availability of fry arc return flows and conserve. And I think irrigation management is really key. I don't know how many folks take advantage of that, but you know, the data that's published by CSU regarding consumption requirements has to be matched with your water supply. I think there are some folks that are in the business of offering that irrigation scheduling service, but we don't have to replace for depletions that we don't pump, right? So the more we can use to conserve our use, I think the better. So those are my ideas for now, short of the when hell freezes over tunnel. Okay.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, in my opinion, this is sort of the payoff part of the panel because you've been very kind to listen to all us regulators tell you all what has to be done. The Attorney General's office, the Division Engineer's office, we're good at that, telling you what needs to be done, what obligations need to be met. But now we've got a couple people that actually have to meet those obligations, and I think their experiences are very valuable to hear. So I'm going to pass it along to Jack Goebel. He's the engineer for the Lower Arkansas Valley Water Conservancy District, and does their water resources and engineering work. So, Jack?
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Everybody seems to be having trouble saying the name of our district, and that's why I still have my card taped to my monitor, so when I answer the phone, I can just read it. So now you know. So anyway, I am a native of the valley, born and raised in McClave, and been away for about a decade, Oklahoma, and was actually in Denver for the last 5 years, and had a couple of kids and decided I want to raise them in a kind of a rural setting. So was fortunate to find this position and move back here, and so I've been back since July. So today I'm going to be talking about the implementation of the irrigation improvement rules. A couple of speakers before me have kind of laid out the reason for the rules, and but I'm going to the first couple of slides are going to be a little bit of a review to kind of ramp me into my presentation. So the purpose of the rules, basically, I like to boil stuff down to simple terms, and because it allows me to understand things. So this is basically how I understand it. So if you increase your irrigation efficiency, so you change from flood irrigation, say, to a sprinkler irrigation, your crops consume more, and therefore you have a reduction in return flows that return to the river, and you have to make up for those. And so that's the basic purpose of the rules as I understand it, and it's been explained 3 or 4 times already today. So again, how do farmers comply with these rules? You have to submit a compact compliance plan to the Division of Water Resources, and like I believe Steve and Bill both said, the only plans that have been submitted in the 4 years since the rules have been going have been Rule 10 plans, and those are group plans. So basically, they're mechanisms that allow multiple farmers to come together and have all their engineering and all their engineering and legal work done as a group to save costs. And they also allow for other water to be used rather than using their own subject water rights. Like Steve mentioned, we've used different supplies other than subject water rights. And it simplifies operations because instead of making replacements for each farmer, you're making it as a big group and a lot more simplified. So what's included in a Rule 10 plan? First of all, you got to determine the amount of return flow maintenance requirements or the deficit that you're causing to the river. And we do that for the coming plan year. And then we also add in the deficits that are from former years that are lagged to the river, that are hitting the river this coming year. And so when we're coming up with the plan, we use what I'll run through an example in a minute, but we use the ISAM, which is a model that models return flows. And what we do with the plan is before the year, we model the whole year, and so it's a projection of what we think is going to happen. And then during the year, after every month, we go in and run the models again and say, okay, what actually did happen? And let's see, so basically, like I said, we determine what we think we're going to have for this year in deficits and what we have for last year, and that gives us a total for the amount of water we think we're going to need to make those replacements. And that basically allows us to determine, okay, how much do we need to get in supplies? And so we obviously overestimate the supplies, and we try to be conservative on how much we think we're going to owe, so we don't run short of water. But like Steve mentioned, the supplies that have been used in the past are, well, there has been water from Aurora, but most recently it's water that the district purchases from Public Board of Water Works. And when I say we purchase it, but we also charge the farmers a fee to be a part of the plan, and then also we determine what their farm owes, and they pay a per acre foot rate for that water. So some of the other supplies that we use are return flows that come from Public Board of Water Works, or Busk Ivanhoe return flows, or one of the big ones that we're going to start using is Friar Oak return flows. And also, so we list out the supplies in the plan, and then we have to determine the operation of our plan and list it out. Okay, this is what we're actually going to do throughout the year. So, like Steve said, this is the fourth year of the plans, fourth year of the rules, and up until I believe last year was the first year there was more than one plan. All the years prior to that, there was only one plan, and all of the farms were in that. And last year, the district before I came along broke off the Fort Lyon members into their own group. They kind of have more specific needs, and like Bill mentioned, the idea is to eventually have them kind of branch off and manage their own group. And this year, there's another plan, like that was mentioned before by Lama, that is not part of what our district oversees. So this kind of gives you an idea. This is for this coming plan year. The amount of acreage that's covered under our plans. As you can see, the majority, or actually about 2/3 of the acreage, comes from Fort Lyon. That's where a lot of the sprinklers are. Okay, so really getting into the engineering side of stuff here. How are the return flows calculated? And again, I tried to boil this down to a simple example that, so I don't put you to sleep. I realize we've had 2 engineers speak before me, and I'm the 3rd one, so I guess 4th with Kevin, so hopefully you've refilled your coffee. But like I said, I try to boil this down and make it simple so it's not too hard to follow. So this kind of gives you a taste for what ISAM looks like. And this is just the top half. This is all I could fit in this view without actually being totally overwhelming. But this is just the top half of one of the tabs in the spreadsheet. So it can be a little overwhelming to just open up and start looking at. But the basics of it are fairly straightforward. And so basically, it's a water budget analysis, basic supply and demand. I was trying to explain it to my wife as I kind of was finally starting to grasp it. And I guess I think I told her it's kind of like balancing a 3D checkbook. It's, you got ins and outs and water going everywhere, and if this happens, then that happens, and if it doesn't, then this happens. And so it can get a little complicated, but anyway, so basically the model estimates and compares return flows before and after an irrigation improvement is made, so before and after a sprinkler is installed. So it models it as if it's, for example, flood irrigation, and then it models it in, for lack of a better term, a parallel universe when the sprinkler is installed. So all the other conditions are constant. So the same rain, the same ditch supply, the same amount of sun, and then it tells you the difference in return flows, and that's the deficit, and that's what your potential injury to the river is. So the major assumptions that come out of, they come from the HI model, which was discussed by Dan earlier, or mentioned by Dan. These are the major assumptions that they have the greatest impact on the deficit. So with flood irrigation, you have 65% max farm irrigation efficiency, and with sprinkler, you have 85%. So what does that mean? Well, the basic explanation of what max farm irrigation efficiency is okay, out of the water that's delivered to your field, how much as a maximum can your crops consume? And so you can see there's a 20% difference there. So that's what drives basically the deficit. And so quickly running through these, the column on your left is basically the information that we ask farmers to bring into us and that we input into the model. And the column on the right is during the operations of the plan, so during the year, we input these monthly. So after the month happens, we say, okay, how much did the canal divert? What was the potential evapotranspiration? What was the precipitation? And then we run the model. All the things on the left are constant, and those are just entered one time. Okay, so now we're getting into the fun stuff here. I'm going to run through an example of ISAM, and don't close your eyes quite yet, because like I said, I've tried to boil it down and make it fairly easy to understand. So I took the Fort Lyon for example. I'm fairly familiar with that growing up down there, and that's where most of our sprinklers are. So in this example, as you can see, I guess I'll point to this screen over here. We've got the Arkansas River running along the bottom, Fort Lyon running along the top, and then we have this imaginary field, this is a typical field that would be in one of our plans, especially on the downstream or the lower half of the Fort Lyon, where shares to acres are about a 1-to-1. So so this example, got a 150 acre field that is served with 150 Fort Lyon shares. And so pre-improvement, so as you can see, flood irrigated, 150 acres here. So I actually tried to get a real representation of what would happen in this field. So this actually is what would have happened in June of 2011. So this was actually what was diverted by their canal. Now, I should stop and say that with any model, it's just a best guess of what happened. And most models are an oversimplification, and it's just a best guess. I mean, I don't know the percentage of time that they're right or this one is right, but it's probably not very high. No offense to Bill and other people that put it together, but it's just, like you saw, it can get really complicated in a hurry, and it's just a best guess at what it is. You could, get ridiculous on making this model, and nobody would understand it, and it'd be impossible to actually get it to run. So with that, we'll run through this model here. So basically, June of 2011, 43,400 acre foot was diverted. And now again, if you're familiar with Fort Lyon and most canals, they run in sets. So, this hypothetical field, imaginary field, may not have actually been irrigated in June of 2011, but that's what the model assumes. So we go forward here. So the first thing that you got to subtract out is canal loss, and with Fort Lyon being a water short ditch and very long ditch, you got a high percentage of canal loss. So you're looking at almost 37% off the top that's assumed. That just disappears into the earth. And then there's an on-farm loss next that actually is applied in the model to the whole ditch before it actually is sent to the farm. But I broke it down to give you an idea of, for this farm in this month, you got about 2 acre feet that was lost in on-farm losses. And so you end up with 41 acre feet to the year, 41 acre feet to the field. And obviously that's figured by 150 shares. There's about, I think, 94,000 shares on the Fort Lyon. So 150 divided by 93,000 multiplied by what's left after these losses, you get 41 acre feet at the field. So this is called the supply at the farm head gate. And so this is where we start getting real specific to a farm. So this 27 acre feet is considered the available water at the farm field. So this is where the max farm efficiencies that we were looking at before is applied. So I've rounded all these numbers, so if you're trying to do a tabulation, they may not add up exactly. But if you multiply 41 acre feet times 65%, because it's flood irrigated, you end up with about 27 acre feet. And there's some other stuff that could work into this. This is where your potential evapotranspiration is worked in and everything. But for simplicity and to not totally bore you, that's the major factor there, is the 65%, and that is what's assumed to be consumed by the crop. So getting into losses here, ISAM assumes a 3.5% on-farm loss. So we had a 3.5% off-farm loss before it got to the field. Now we have a 3.5% on-farm loss. So that comes out of the 41 acre feet, or the supply at the farm head gate. That's the first loss. Then you have tailwater and runoff, but not a whole lot of runoff in the valley, particularly in Port Lyon fields. Not a whole lot of tailwater for that matter. Quick story, I spent some of my younger years irrigating on the Fort Lyon, and hard work. I can see why they're putting in sprinklers, because there was none whenever I did it. And another reason why I decided I got to go get an education, because I'm not tough enough to do this for the rest of my life. But I will say this 10% is kind of been a question on specifically the Fort Lyon being the water short ditch. And I remember one day this other kid and I were working together, and it felt like 130 degrees out. And we were irrigating. We made a couple of sets. We had a couple of sets, and we were about 11 hours into our shift, and we went and parked the pickup we were using, the farm truck, in the shade, and we had the AC cranked, and we were just sitting there. Man, it was great. You know, we were sweating, and it just felt great. And lo and behold, the boss drives up, and we didn't see him coming, and I'm sitting in the driver's seat, and I look over, and Phil's sitting there, and he's like, "Roll down your window." So I rolled down, and he said, "You realize you got water running off your field over here, right?" And there was some cuss words involved, and he said, "Get over there and change your set." And so I can tell you from experience that this 10% running off the field, in our case, that never happened again. So I don't know. I mean, every farm's different and it's managed different, but from the rest of my 2 or 3 years after that working there, that never happened again. So a little experience for you there. So this is applied straight. So you subtract out your, I guess I can point up here. Subtract out your on-farm loss from your 41 acre feet, and 10% of what's left is considered runoff. Now again, this is for flood irrigation. And then you have deep percolation, and this is where the model really gets confusing and cumbersome whenever you start getting into soil moisture conditions. Okay, if it starts out pretty dry, you're going to first feel the soil moisture profile, and then on and on and on, and there's some iteration there. But to keep it fairly simple, the deep percolation is what basically makes it past the root zone and starts heading back to the river. And so in this example, it's about 9 acre feet. SED losses, so Bill can correct me if I'm wrong here, but what I understand these to be are non-beneficial consumptive use of water, and maybe some evaporation out of ditches and stuff like that. So basically this is taken from your on-farm losses and your tailwater. There is a set percentage for each month, and I guess it's applied to all the ditches. Is that correct? That's correct. So it's applied to all the ditches, and it's basically so like I said, on-farm loss and tailwater. So the way I visualize it is you got water, you know, going back to the river, what the weeds and what the tamaracks and whatever suck up. So that's just lost to the atmosphere and to plants, and that's subtracted out of what returns to the river, I guess is a simple way to put it. And so what you end up with is about 12 acre feet net return flows, and that amounts to about 29% of your supply at the farm head gate. So 29% in this example is headed back to the river. Now I'll run through this one a little quicker, but this is your improved condition. So you got your sprinkler, and you usually have a head stabilization pond on the upper end of the field there that you pump out of. So this is kind of a typical example of acreage. So you go from your 150 acres to 120 acre pivot, and then you got about 25 acre foot of flood still left. And then, you know, I think in this example I used like a 2 acre pond or something like that. So, so kind of moving along here. So same exact month and canal, everything's the same except the improvement. So kind of heading along here, same ditch loss, same off-farm loss. You end up with the same amount of water to the field. This is where the big difference hits. So if you remember before, I think we had 27 acre feet that was consumed by the crop. Since you installed an improvement or a sprinkler that is more efficient and it applies the water more efficiently, I guess it's been proven that more is consumed by the crops. So you got a difference of about 4 acre feet more that's consumed by the crop. And this is where that 85%, so before we had 65%, this is where the 85% is applied. And that's the driving force behind this whole thing. So if you're gonna remember anything, that's it. Again, we have on-farm loss, same as it was last time. That's applied to this 41 acre feet that hits the field. Tailwater has changed. So we went from 4 acre feet to 1 acre feet. And you would think, well, why is there any tailwater? Well, because you still have this 25 acres of flood there. So it still figures in, and it's actually a little less than 1 acre foot. I just didn't want to go too far into decimals here. So 1 acre foot less, because any acreage that's under the sprinkler is assumed to have 0 tailwater. Deep percolation is less. I guess being able to apply it more efficiently, you have less that makes it past the root zone. Your SEV losses are less, again, because tailwater is less, and that's one of the 2 things that's taken out of. Okay, so here's another big difference here. Pond seepage. So in the prior example, you didn't have a pond, and now you do, and so you have seepage from that pond. And this, and I'll run through how pond seepage is calculated in just a minute, but basically this is what ISAM would calculate in this example as ISAM sits now. 3.5 acre foot of pond seepage goes to return flows. So that's important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Okay, sounds good. So I'm about to wrap it up here. So we end up with 10 acre feet return flows, and before we had 12, so that difference is 2 acre feet. So that is quote unquote the deficit. So that's the hole that you're creating in the return flows making it back to the river. So kind of real quick on lagging here, talked about it a couple, or other folks have talked about it as well, but basically the deep percolation component of that deficit has to be lagged because it doesn't hit the river right away, like the tailwater is assumed to hit the river. So everything that drops into the ground, the on-farm loss, the deep percolation, or the pond seepage has to be lagged back to the river. And that's done using the groundwater analysis model that was created for the HI model. Unit response functions, I won't get into explanation of that other than to tell you that those are unique to each canal and each reach of the river. Okay, so talking about head stabilization ponds real quick. So this is a picture of a pond that feeds a sprinkler. So it's kind of typically what they look like. Now this is, I'll explain real quick how pond seepage is calculated. So this is how ISAM calculates it. Therefore, when I first started, I was told, well, it's 3% of what goes into the pond is calculated as seepage, and that's actually not how ISAM calculates it. So basically, you take the area of the pond, the surface area, and there's an assumed seepage rate of basically 0.7 feet per day, so that's depth per day into the ground, and the number of days that the pond is full. Now, ISAM assumes, we don't go in and say, okay, it's been full 6 days out of this month. It assumes for every month You know, for June, there's 12. For July, you know, I'm making those up because I can't remember offhand, but it assumes. So again, it's oversimplified, but it's a guess at what's actually occurring. So I should back up and say it's the minimum between that multiplication and, or I should say, or 10% of that supply at the farm head gate, which is the 41 acre feet in those two examples. And more often than not, it hits that 10%. And so that, now Brian is going to talk in just a minute about actually the results of the pond study, but that's how ISAM calculates it. So there was a stipulation between the state engineer and 2 Fort Lyon farmers that are actually here today that was to conduct a 2-year pond seepage study to measure pond seepage in a minimum of 20 ponds, and their objection to the way ISAM calculated it was, well, we should get more seepage than that. Well, okay, well, let's prove it. So we have a pond study that's going on right now where we finished our first year, and I need to wrap it up here, so I'm going to get through this later. Brian talked about it, but basically, pond study. Okay, so monthly operations. Now, excuse me, I'm kind of taking a little too long on my explanation here of ISAM, so I'll fly through this. But basically, like I said, each month we calculate the deficits for each farm, add them all together, and they're applied at each river reach along the river, 18 river reaches on the main stem. We deduct out return flows that we have from Fire Arc or Pueblo Board of Waterworks. And then the deliveries are made from Pueblo or Lake Meredith. Like Steve said, we contract exchange water into Lake Meredith and make it out of there just so we reduce our transit losses on the river. And then the transit losses are calculated by the division engineer's office, and that's added to the total release, so that can be subtracted as it goes down the river. And this is my last slide. This shows you an example of kind of, the black line is actual years that the Rural 10 plan has been in operation. The blue line is just if it would have been in place, and this is with 2013 acreages. So you can see it jumps all over the place, but it more or less follows the hydrology of the river. So when the river's high, more is owed. When the river's low, less is owed. So anyway, that's my presentation.
Thanks. So we've had a lot of interesting information. There's one more really interesting piece, and I'd ask you all to just indulge us with a few minutes of your break time and let us go through that, because I think it punctuates what we're talking about very well. Brian Lauritsen, consultant, he's going to talk about those head stabilization ponds and some studies. Brian.
Okay, we'll start it off first. I am not an engineer. No offense to anyone. Okay, I'm with Valley Ag Consulting, a small consulting firm in the valley here. I've been working in the area for going on 23 years now, I guess. And I was contacted in 2012 to help with this pond study, to be the local contact and to do the day-to-day work on it and get it to work. See if I can punch this right. There we go. The objective of this pond study was to figure out the seepage rate of the ponds that we're storing the water in momentarily before they go through the sprinklers. So the main thing, I mean, simply we're measuring the inflow and the outflow. Then I turn it over to the engineers, and they figure the evaporation and the rainfall to come up with an actual seepage rate. The timeline of this project is that it was started in 2011. That was the year they first put it in. Unfortunately, one of the people that had working on it didn't put these things in right. I was contacted in 2012 to help with it. I spent the year of 2012 trying to figure everything out, huge learning curve with these meters and everything, and getting the systems installed so that they're working. Unfortunately, in 2012, as everybody knows, we were very dry. Most of these pond sites are under the Fort Lyon. We only had 6 runs of water. And so if a run started, I started the first run and I think I had 2 meters that worked. you know, so then I had to go from there and figure out what was wrong, get them reset, see if they worked the next one. So by the end of the year, after 6 runs, I had them pretty much figured out and going, except one. Then in 2013, we increased the water a little bit. We had 12 runs, 12 and a half runs. And so we got a lot of useful information. At that time, the state took our information and they actually used it to adjust the augmentation that these particular ponds were required to pay back to the river. 2014, like Jack said, is our second full year. We have to have 2 full years of data. This is our second year. Hopefully things will go even smoother this year and we'll get more data. And then after that, we're required to monitor a certain number of ponds for another 2 years to make sure these 2 years that we did weren't an anomaly. So that's kind of the quick basis of this. Here's just another picture. This is a fairly large pond for the ones we're on, but you can see, you know, this pipe is the inlet, and then on the far side is the outlet with the pump. And that's kind of just a normal pond. Some of our ponds, well, most of them actually go into a settling pond first to get the dirt out of them so the farmer can reach in with the backhoe and clean them out easier as opposed to depositing all the dirt in their big ponds. Then this picture is just an aerial view of a typical setup. You can see up in the left-hand corner is the pond. That's where our inflow meter is at. And then most of our outflow meters are actually at the pivot point, just with the micrometer that's in the pivot. Okay, this is a typical layout for one of my setups. We use mostly ultrasonic meters. And the meter, the meter is, we have transducers that are attached to the pipe, and they essentially send an ultrasonic wave back and forth between the 2 meters, and the time difference between when it sends it upstream and downstream, it figures a velocity. So for these particular meters, we have to have a full pipe because they don't figure the volume. All we're doing is figuring the velocity of the water going through the pipe. So that's one of the requirements of this. And then in addition, in this box, that's where our meter's at, that's where our battery's at, the solar controller, and then we have a solar panel that powers it all because most of these do not have power at the ponds. We do have a couple that are getting set up that way, but almost all of them are this setup right here. This is the inside of the box, another setup. You can see the battery, the meter, and our solar collector there. It's actually a very neat unit. It works very well. This is another, we do have 2 additional inflow meters we use. This is called a K-Tech. It's the little blue thing right there. And it measures with a Doppler that goes down and hits the water. And it is not measuring the velocity. In this case, it's measuring the volume. It's just measuring the depth of that water. So we use them, like for this one, as a weir box or a partial flume, however you want to call it. Of course, it has to be installed correctly. And no offense, but most of the flumes out there are not installed correctly. There's too much flow going through them. In fact, this one, I just set up this spring. We've had one run of water through it, and I'm getting the farmer to dig a bigger pit before the flume because we're still getting just a little bit too much velocity going through it. It should be just gravity fed going through it, and it's not. And so this just measures the depth of the water so that we can figure the flow, but we have to have that constant velocity to do that. We also have what we call SDRs, which are stage discharge recorders. They are used on these flumes also. And they essentially, we build a stilling basin beside the flume with a little pipe connection between the 2, and we have a float with the meter sitting on top of it, and it again just measures the depth of the water, and those work very well too once you get them calibrated. From there, so like I said, most of them are the ultrasonic meters. Of 29 ponds that I've currently got going, only 4 are not ultrasonics. And so one of the challenges of this whole project was finding the correct spot to put these transducers, and that's the little meters that send the signal through, because there's just all different ways these guys have put these ponds together, and finding the spot where we don't have very much turbulence and the pipe is full has sometimes been a challenge. This is a new one I put in this spring also. The next picture shows it in use. And you can see it's all underwater except for the head of the pipe. And we've just put a 45 on the pipe and a little extension to make sure that pipe always stays full of water. And then that's one that's in use there. This is just another example of how we've got a lot of variations. This one barely comes up out of the ground. It's not really installed per manufacturer's specifications, but it works dang good. I haven't had an issue with this one in 2 years. Knock on wood. But so we install them in several different ways. This is another new pond that we just put in this spring, and the guy wanted one put in. This is a temporary system right now. You can see there's no solar collector. Our cables were not long enough to go up to my stand that I've got up on the top of the ditch bank. So we just put it in temporarily with a battery. But that one just bubbles up out of that pipe. And, so we've got, that was one of the things we had to learn. We had to change and go to. Most of these were set outside of the ponds. They had dug a hole and put a nice big culvert and everything, but they didn't work because there was air bubbles in the pipeline. So we've had to move them virtually all into the ponds. We've got submersible cables that can be underwater. I've got some buried in dirt. Most of them end up getting buried in the mud. But to this point, I've never had to change one of those out, so they do work very well. Let's see. And then this is our outflow meter. Every one of our pond sites, to this point, the outflow meter is a micrometer. And most of you guys are familiar with it if you've been around any of these type of things. This one's mounted on the pivot at the pivot point. It's just a mechanical propeller that measures the water. Very accurate, very dependable, nice and consistent. They have bearings that go out once in a while, but that's about it. We have the newer ponds, most of them, these meters are located at the pump site on the pond, so that makes it a little easier for us. So my guy that I send out in the middle of summer doesn't have to walk through a cornfield to get to the pivot, so he kind of appreciates that. Just another picture of the meter itself as you open it up. Shows acre feet. Most of ours are in acre feet, some are in gallons. This is a picture, I know it's hard to see, but just to give you an idea, they showed a picture earlier of all the pivots that have went up. This matches that map, but this was the map of all of our pond sites in 2013. Most of them you can see are essentially right above Lamar and Wiley area, because most of them are under the Fort Lyon. We do have some over here near Chiraw and north of La Junta, and then we had one down on the state line, but unfortunately it's never gotten any water, so we're going to pull it. So kind of a summary of what we've done so far. We started with 25 ponds in 2011. Of those 23 ponds, we got good information that we're able to put in the ISAM model that Jack explained is very complicated. You need a beer when you're trying to look at it. And but we had one pond that we had no water. Like I said, we're going to pull it. And we had one pond I did not get figured out until yesterday. So that made my day yesterday. And we've added actually 4 ponds now in 2014. And we're looking at adding one more extremely large one that they're going to run 6 pivots off of at a time. So we want to see the differences in a large pond. Some of the challenges, like I said, is finding the correct location for the meters so that they work and work consistently. We have had some issues with the equipment. They had some electronic issues. These meters have never been used in these type of environments before, so there's a big learning curve there. And then our drought has added to it. We haven't had a whole lot of water where we get a lot of data off of it. Just quickly, the results. In the ISAM estimate, like Jack said, they were estimating 0.167 feet per day. The pond study for the ones we got in averaged 0.311 feet per day. But essentially, we're just continuing the project, hopefully making it a little more simplified. We're working on figuring out ways to do data better and working on some telemetry to gather all the data. So I know we're out of time, so I will end with that, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Brian, and all the panelists. I think that we've gotten into our break time a little bit. Probably don't have time for questions. Maybe one or two?
Let's take one question, please.
Any questions out there? Yes.
Jack was discussing the return flow. and the flooding irrigation versus the sprinkler. And one thing you didn't address was evaporation. Is there a difference between the two on evaporation?
Did you all hear the question? So Jack was talking about return flows, and there's an evaporation component in the change from flood to,
Is there a difference, yeah, and do we have a difference in evaporation between flood irrigation and
Just-
sprinkler irrigation? Because that wasn't addressed when he was computing the return flow.
right. So she's asking about the difference in the evap component when changing from flood to sprinkler.
No, I mean, I don't know if this one, but no difference. So it's basically calculated the same way as far as evaporation goes.
But I mean, has it ever been studied on if there's a difference, or are you just saying there is no difference?
I don't know about being studied. I guess not.
Not specifically.
I guess not specifically, no.
That's my question, because I would think when you're sending it out in small particles with our dry environment, it's going to evaporate more in a sprinkler system than in a flood, but I don't know. That's why I was curious.
I guess I'm not aware of any studies that have been done, so.
Please catch our panelists out in the hall for any other questions. Thank you very much.
Give him another hand.